And I want to thank the Social Democrats for putting this motion on the schedule and giving us an opportunity to discuss the Mother and Babies Institutions Redress Scheme. The make-up of the Mother and Baby Institutions Payment Scheme is very disappointing, and it's exclusionary rather than inclusive. People who are resident in mother and baby institutions for 6 months or less are deeply disappointed and distressed to find out that they remain excluded from the scheme. Inclusion and equality are clearly missing from the proposed scheme. It seems to be more about achieving reduced costs and reduced liability. And what it has achieved is an increased mistrust among survivors, which was already high as a direct result of their appalling treatment by successive governments. Provisions seeking to deny or limit liability by the state or other private entities should not be included in this legislation or the payment scheme. It is simply not good enough, and it is time for this government to respect all mother and baby home survivors and families. It is also vitally important that the relevant religious congregations and pharmaceutical organisations do not avoid accountability. They must contribute significant finances to fund the scheme. Substantive recourse from these bodies needs to be insisted upon immediately. It is time that religious institutions and pharmaceutical companies are forced to compensate survivors for the harm and the suffering that they caused. Minister, there is no recognition for the hurt or trauma experienced by children separated at birth from their mothers. The exclusion of children resident in a home for less than 6 months is a dereliction of the state's responsibility to all survivors. The recommendations and views shared by survivors conducted by Oak Consulting have been largely ignored. The concerns raised by Dr Niall Muldoon, Special Rapporteur on Child Protection, in a report commissioned by you, Minister, are not reflected in redress plans either. The UN Special Rapporteur, UN Human Rights Committee and UN human rights experts have individually called for appropriate compensation, removal of legal waivers and for any scheme to address child victims of racial discrimination within Irish institutions from 1940 up until the 1990s. These calls have also been largely ignored, and this is totally unacceptable. So it is time to change the redress scheme to meet the needs of survivors and families. What this current scheme does is effectively create a hierarchy of suffering. We know the majority of survivors spend 6 months or less in a mother and baby or county home. The Commission's authors state this. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission are calling for the legislation to be amended to remove the requirement of a 6-month stay to ensure that all children who are resident in a relevant institution and or who were adopted are eligible to apply to the scheme. The Minister is rowing back on appointing a human rights expert to examine testimony given to the Commission of Investigation into mother and baby homes is unacceptable. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties wrote to the Minister setting out exactly why this is essential. So this Minister has once again ignored this plea. Instead, you have opted to introduce a new initiative to support survivors to tell their personal story so that it can be formally recorded and accepted as part of the official record. So, whilst we welcome the development of a national site of remembrance and interpretation as proposed for Sean McDermott Street, new testimony will not remedy the problem that came to light in June 2021, that the vast majority of the evidence already given by survivors to the Commission was not effectively considered. An independent examination of the testimony already given to the Commission is vital to ensure justice is done, because a human rights legal expert will be able to properly assess whether there is evidence of human rights abuse and potentially crimes that must be investigated in the original testimony given by survivors. The gathering of stories outside of a formal legal process does not meet Ireland's human rights obligations to ensure truth, justice and accountability under the ICCPR, the European Convention on Human Rights, and our own Constitution's protection of due process and fair procedures. No justice can be delivered if the evidence never comes to light or is maintained in a parallel system of evidence gathered outside of a formal legal process. So, to reiterate, Minister, all of those affected need to be treated equally and fairly, regardless of how long they spent in an institution. It does not matter what age the person was when they were removed from their family. It has had an impact on them. The Government must respect all mother and baby home survivors and families. It must change the redress scheme to meet the needs of all survivors and families. And it must force religious institutions and pharmaceutical companies to contribute significant finances for the compensation of survivors and families.